I'm struck by Candy returning to this notion that we're so very uncomfortable as a society talking about death and facing it squarely. And so you think about the ways in which the Trump administration handled the pandemic and the unwillingness to take really seriously the loss of life, right? And to deny it and to downplay it, and for reasons perhaps similar and perhaps different than the administration that you're talking about in the previous flu pandemic, but the ways in which that denial of death, as it were, of a serious discussion about it, and the ways in which religion perhaps plays into that, insofar as white evangelicals are willing to continue to back this narrative, right, and to downplay the ways in which the pandemic is affecting us in ways that have to do in some ways with their religious concerns or beliefs or religious investments in Trump and his administration and his way of describing the current socio-political context of the United States. The rush to get back to normal, the rush to get our schools back open, the rush to get our churches back open, and death be damned, as it were, right? And so this denial of death and the effect that it's having upon the country on the one hand, writ large. But then again, for me, in the specificity of the context, for me, of thinking about African Americans or thinking about Black American communities who have lived especially precarious lives, who have always already been in very close, inextricable proximity to death, right? And so we have perhaps an intensification in this moment of death and deathliness, but it is not something that's out of the norm. And so talking about death, I think, within Black communities, unfortunately, is all too much the norm, because death is ever present. It's a life lived within the context of the specter of death, of not knowing in which in any moment one might be subject to death because one is Black. And this is, I think, for me, thinking about that important article that Claudia Rankine wrote a few years ago, right after the Charleston massacre in South Carolina, where she was talking about the condition of Black life is one of mourning, right? That mourning is this kind of constant thing that's happening because of the precarity of Black life and the disposability of Black life, and the ways in which Black people are always being subject to not only death at the hands of these medical pandemic issues, but also, again, vigilante violence and also state-sponsored violence against Black bodies. And so that one is almost always in a kind of state of perpetual mourning, so that when we see the pandemic coming and we see additional loss of life, it's a heightening of that. And then we see people being murdered in the midst of pandemics. So I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, an essential worker working in the middle of a pandemic, right? And she's killed by the police, and right, and the layers upon layers of deathliness that we're experiencing, and thinking about how we're mourning the individual losses of lives lost to COVID and the lives lost to racial injustice at the same time, among communities who have had all too much death to deal with. And how does one mourn that, right? Christina Sharp, the scholar, says, how does one mourn that which is interminable, right? There's almost a sense that to really begin to mourn, an event has to be over. But Black death and dying is perpetual in such a way that how can one really begin to mourn that?